A woman in a gray tailored suit stood outside a courthouse, her hands trembling so hard she had to press them against her coat to hide it. Rain had started to fall, but she didn't move toward the car waiting at the curb. Her lawyer held a single photograph, a little girl with two neat braids, and a small crescent-shaped birthmark on her wrist. "If this is true," he said quietly, "you could lose everything you built. The company, your reputation, all of it." Yvette Calloway did not answer. She could not stop staring at the photo, at a face that looked nothing like her own and yet somehow felt like looking into a mirror she'd been avoiding for 8 years. Somewhere behind her, a man's voice she once trusted was already whispering to reporters that she'd lost her mind. She did not care. Because 6 months earlier, that little girl's mother had been a complete stranger, a tired woman who braided hair under a bridge for spare coins, with absolutely no idea that her life, and everything she believed about her own daughter, was about to collide head-on with the darkest secret Yvette Calloway had buried for 8 long, silent years. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to Amazing Folktale, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Hype up the video. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what your local time is in the comments below. I love seeing how these stories connect people from all around the world. Let's get started. Under the Delmont Avenue overpass, where the city's noise softened into a low hum of passing tires, Amara Whitfield had built a life out of a folding stool, a plastic mirror nailed to a support beam, and a small tin box for coins. She braided hair there 6 days a week, rain or shine, because it was the only work that let her keep her children close enough to watch. Zuri, 7 years old, sat on an overturned bucket beside her, doing her times tables on the back of a flyer, tongue poking out the corner of her mouth in concentration. Kofi, 4, slept most mornings against a folded blanket propped against a concrete pillar, his small chest rising and falling to the rhythm of his mother's hands, moving through a stranger's hair. Amara worked fast and gentle, the way her own mother had taught her back home, weaving cornrows and box braids with a precision that made regular customers return week after week, even when they could have gone somewhere warmer, somewhere with air conditioning, and a proper chair and a receipt printer. She kept a small notebook tucked into her bag, its pages soft from handling, where she wrote down every customer's name and preferred style, so that when Miss Delphine came back after 3 weeks, Amara already remembered she liked her part slightly off-center, or that a young mother named Trish always wanted extra length on the left side to hide a scar near her ear she never talked about. It was a small thing. It cost nothing, but it told her customers, every single time, that they were more than a transaction to her, and it was one of the only forms of pride Amara still had left to offer the world. On good days, she made $60, maybe $70, enough for groceries and a little toward whatever bill was screaming loudest that week. On bad days, rainy days, days when customers didn't come, days when the city sent someone new to check permits, and she had to pack up and move 2 blocks over, she made nothing at all, and she'd walk home with Zuri's hand in one of hers and Kofi balanced on her hip, rehearsing in her head how to explain, again, that dinner would be something small. She hadn't always lived like this. 3 years ago, Amara had a badge that said medical records clerk clipped to her blouse, a small apartment with a working stove, and a husband named Reggie who told her every single day that he was going to take care of her forever. She believed him. Her mother had not. Back then, Amara's mornings looked entirely different. She'd wake at 6, iron Reggie's shirt while the coffee brewed, drop Zuri at daycare, and drive to St. Agnes Memorial Hospital, where she spent 8 hours a day filing patient charts with a precision her supervisor once called borderline artistic. She liked the quiet rhythm of it, the soft hum of the records room, the satisfaction of a folder returned to its exact correct place, the sense that she was part of something orderly in a world that so rarely was. She had planned back then to go back to school eventually, maybe become a records administrator, maybe even a nurse. She had plans. She had a 5-year calendar taped inside her kitchen cabinet, with little goals written in her own careful handwriting. None of it had prepared her for the version of Reggie that started showing up in the last 6 months of their marriage. That man carries secrets the way other men carry wallets, her mother had warned her the week before the wedding, sitting on the porch back home, arms crossed, eyes tired. His whole family hides things, Amara. You'll spend your marriage finding out what. Amara had laughed it off then. She was 24 and in love, and love felt like the safest place in the world. She married Reggie in a small church with folding chairs, and for 2 years, life was ordinary in the best way: grocery runs, Sunday dinners, Zuri's first steps, Kofi on the way. Then the men started showing up. At first it was just phone calls Reggie would take outside, his voice dropping low enough that Amara couldn't make out the words, though she remembered the tone of them: clipped, apologetic, afraid. Then it was strangers parked outside their apartment building at odd hours, sitting in cars with the engines running, watching the front door like it owed them something. Amara asked Reggie about it twice. Both times he told her it was nothing, work stuff, nothing for her to worry her pretty head over. She let herself believe him, because the alternative, that her husband was in real danger, that their family was in real danger, was too heavy to carry alongside a newborn and a toddler. Then, one Tuesday morning, Reggie kissed both children on the forehead, told Amara he loved her more than anything in this world, and never came home again. She waited 3 days before calling anyone. She told herself he'd gotten held up, that his phone had died, that there was some ordinary explanation waiting to embarrass her for panicking. By the 4th day she was calling hospitals. By the 6th, she was calling his mother, who answered every question with a strange, tight evasiveness that Amara would only understand much later. She learned eventually from a cousin, not from Reggie, and certainly not from his mother, that he owed a serious sum of money to people who did not accept apologies as payment. People connected to the underground gambling circuit he'd been hiding from her for over a year. He had run, and in running, he had left behind a wife with a 4-year-old, a newborn, and a rent bill that didn't care whose fault any of it was. The hospital records job had required steady hours and a reliable babysitter, 2 things Amara no longer had once Reggie's mother, the only free childcare she'd ever had, grew colder and more distant with every visit, as though being near Amara and the children reminded her of something she wanted to forget. Amara lost the job within 3 months, laid off officially for attendance issues, though she knew the real reason was that no manager wants to keep explaining a schedule around a single mother's chronic childcare emergencies. She sold what she could, her wedding ring first, then the television, then, eventually, most of the furniture. She moved twice, each apartment smaller than the last, the walls closing in a little more with every move, until there was no apartment left to move to, only a shelter with a 2-week limit, and then, when the 2 weeks ran out and no extension was granted, the bridge. She remembered the first night under the overpass with a clarity that still made her stomach hurt. Zuri had asked, in the small, matter-of-fact voice children use when they haven't yet learned to be afraid of the right things, "Is this camping, Mommy?" And Amara had said yes, sweetheart, just for a little while, and had spent the whole night awake, listening to traffic overhead, promising herself in the dark that a little while would not become forever. People who passed Amara on the street sometimes looked at her the way you'd look at a warning sign, quickly, and then away. They didn't see the woman who used to file patient charts with perfect penmanship. They didn't see the woman who still ironed her children's secondhand clothes every night, so they'd look presentable for school, even when she herself hadn't eaten. Pressing the collar of Zuri's uniform with a travel iron she kept plugged into a borrowed outlet at a friend's apartment because pride, it turned out, was one of the last things poverty hadn't managed to take from her. They saw a woman under a bridge, and they made their assumptions, and they walked on. What they also didn't see was the discipline it took to run a business with no walls. Amara kept her tools in a repurposed toolbox that latched shut against the rain. She kept a small first aid kit for the inevitable nicked scalp or pulled too tight braid. She had a system for everything. A system for hand sanitizer between clients during flu season. A system for keeping Kofi entertained with a set of worn picture books during long appointments. A system for stretching a single loaf of bread across 3 days if the week ran thin. None of it looked like success to the people rushing past on their way to somewhere better. But to Amara, every one of those small systems was proof that she hadn't given up, that she was still, in her own way, keeping her family standing upright. But the ones who sat down in her folding chair saw something else. They saw hands that moved like they were telling a story. A regular customer, an older woman named Miss Delphine who came every 3 weeks for a fresh set of twists, once tilted her head and said, You know, the way you part hair dead straight down the middle, tight at the root. I only ever saw one other woman braid like that. Years ago. Funny how hands remember things. Amara had smiled politely and said nothing, because customers said all kinds of things to fill the silence, and she had learned not to chase every stray comment down a rabbit hole. She had learned to survive one day at a time, one braid at a time, one child's stomach filled at a time. There was one thing about Amara that even Miss Delphine had never noticed, tucked as it always was beneath a thin beaded bracelet on Zuri's left wrist, a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Amara covered it out of habit, an old unexplained instinct passed down from her late mother-in-law, who had once told her in a tone that did not invite questions, "Keep that covered, child. Some things are safer hidden." Amara had never understood why. She had simply obeyed, the way you obey a warning from someone who clearly knows something you don't. She did not know, sitting under that bridge with a comb in one hand and her daughter's future in the other, that the answer to that warning was about to drive past her in a silver Mercedes. 14 miles across town, in a glass office on the 11th floor of Callaway Construction, Yvette Callaway signed her name to a maternity ward donation she had made every single year for 8 years. Always on the same date, always anonymously, always in an amount large enough to fund an entire wing's equipment upgrade. No one at the company knew why. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Priya, had stopped asking after the 3rd year, though she still noticed the way Yvette's face changed on that particular date every June. A stillness that settled over her employer for exactly one day before life resumed as normal. Some things, Yvette always said when pressed, don't need a reason attached to them. It was a lie, but it was one she'd told so many times it almost felt true. From the outside, Yvette's life looked like the kind of story people told at galas as proof that grief could be survived with grace. Widowed at 39, she had taken the reins of a construction empire most people assumed she'd sell within the year, and instead had grown it by nearly 30% in 4 years through sheer will and an eye for detail her late husband had always credited as the real engine behind the company's biggest contracts. She showed up to every site inspection in heels that ruined by lunchtime. She read every contract herself, line by line, refusing to let anyone tell her which details mattered and which didn't. People respected her. Some feared her, a little. Almost none of them knew her. Not the version of her that existed after the office lights went off and the house went quiet. To the outside world, Yvette had everything. She had inherited the company from her late husband, Marcus Callaway, a man the city had once called a builder of futures, in a memorial article that made her wince every time she reread it. She had a house with more rooms than she used, a driver she rarely needed because she liked to drive herself, and a wardrobe of tailored suits that made boardrooms go quiet when she walked in. What no one knew was that Yvette kept a drawer in her office locked at all times, a small brass key she wore on a chain tucked under her blouse, never removed, not even at night. Priya had worked for her for 6 years and had never once been allowed near that drawer. She'd learned early that if she so much as leaned against that side of the desk, Yvette's whole demeanor shifted, polite but immovable, like a door closing softly but completely. Inside that drawer was a single hospital bracelet, a folded ultrasound photo gone soft at the creases, and a manila folder with a redacted name. 8 years earlier, a much younger Yvette had been rushed into street. Agnes Memorial alone, in the middle of the night, no husband beside her, laboring through complications that made the nurses speak to each other in the clipped, careful tones doctors use when they're worried but don't want the patient to know it. Marcus had been away on a business trip he refused to cut short, a fact Yvette had spent years trying not to resent, and never quite succeeding. She remembered calling him from the hospital bed between contractions, remembered him saying he'd catch the first flight back, remembered believing him even as the pain in her lower back told her there wasn't going to be time. She remembered the fluorescent lights, too bright, humming faintly overhead. She remembered a nurse's hand gripping hers so tightly it left marks. She remembered being told the baby was in distress, remembered a flurry of movement, machines, raised voices trying to sound calm and failing. And then she remembered waking up 2 days later, groggy from medication, her body aching in ways she hadn't been warned about, to a doctor's face arranged into practiced sympathy, telling her the baby had not survived the delivery. She never saw the child. She was told there was nothing left to see, that in cases like this, sometimes it was kinder not to. She had been too weak, too drugged, too shattered to argue. Marcus arrived 6 hours after the fact, guilt written across his face for missing it, and the two of them had grieved together in the particular silence of a couple who don't yet know how to talk about the thing that's broken them. For 8 years, Yvette had grieved a daughter she was told never took a breath. She had built the maternity wing donation into a private ritual of mourning nobody else was allowed to witness, driving to the hospital alone every June, standing in the parking lot for exactly as long as it took to feel the grief pass through her like weather, and then driving home again without ever going inside. She had never remarried, never had another child, and had let the world believe her marriage to Marcus was simply complicated, rather than admit that some nights, even 8 years later, she still woke up reaching instinctively for a baby that was never placed in her arms, her hands closing around nothing but blanket and darkness. What the outside world also didn't know was that Yvette had begun, quietly and recently, to ask questions she had buried for 8 years. It started at a hospital fundraiser 3 months earlier. A chance conversation with a retired nurse who'd mentioned, entirely without malice, that St. Agnes had cleaned up a real mess in its records department around the time Yvette had delivered, vague enough to mean nothing, specific enough to mean everything. Then came an offhand comment from a hospital administrator, months later at another event, about record discrepancies from that same era. Discrepancies he clearly hadn't meant to mention and immediately tried to walk back. Small things. Things that shouldn't have mattered. But they had lodged in her chest like splinters, impossible to ignore once she'd noticed them, and lately, she found herself pulling that folder out of the drawer more nights than not, staring at a redacted name, as though it might rearrange itself into an answer if she looked long enough, tracing the black bar with one finger, like it might lift if she pressed hard enough. She had also, in the last few weeks, begun arguing quietly, carefully, the way people argue when they're trying not to accuse someone of something they can't yet prove, with her late husband's brother, Daniel. "She's still out there," Daniel had told her once. 2 weeks ago, in a tone he probably thought sounded comforting. "Whoever you're looking for. If she wanted to be found, Yvette, she would have found you by now, let it rest." Yvette had looked at him for a long moment, unable to name the unease crawling up the back of her neck. "How do you know it's a she?" she'd asked quietly, "when I never told you the baby's sex?" Daniel had smiled, smooth as ever, and changed the subject. She hadn't forgotten it. She wasn't the kind of woman who forgot things like that. Daniel Calloway was the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday, tipped generously in front of company, and had never once, in 8 years, raised his voice at his sister-in-law in public. People at Calloway Construction adored him. He was the co-owner who still knew the security guards' names, who brought pastries to the Monday meetings, who told self-deprecating jokes about his golf swing that made the room laugh on cue. He had a gift, honed over decades, for making people feel like the most important person in the room, and he deployed that gift the way other men deployed a firm handshake, constantly, effortlessly, and almost always for a purpose he never bothered to disclose. When Marcus died 4 years earlier, a sudden heart attack at 53 that left the whole company reeling, Daniel had stepped into the role of grieving brother with such convincing sincerity that Yvette had leaned on him more heavily than she leaned on almost anyone else in those first raw months. He'd handled the funeral logistics. He'd fielded calls from anxious board members. He'd sat with her in the quiet hours after the guests left, saying almost nothing, simply being present in a way that felt, at the time, like the truest form of loyalty a person could offer. It would take Yvette years to understand that his presence in those months hadn't been loyalty at all. It had been proximity, the careful positioning of a man making sure he stayed close enough to control what she might eventually find. Privately, Daniel had spent the last several months pressuring Yvette to sell the company. "The market's never going to be better than it is right now," he told her over dinner at a restaurant he'd chosen specifically because the noise made it hard for anyone at nearby tables to overhear. "We sell now. We walk away with more money than either of us could spend in 2 lifetimes. Why keep dragging this out?" "Marcus built this company from nothing," Yvette said. "I'm not selling it because the market's convenient." Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly, just long enough for anyone paying close attention to notice which Yvette, distracted by grief and half a glass of wine, did not. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "holding on to the past costs more than people realize. Before the past catches up to us." It was such a strange thing to say that Yvette almost asked him to explain it. She didn't. She let it go, the way she'd let go of a dozen strange comments from Daniel over the years, chalking it up to his particular brand of dramatic phrasing. What Yvette did not see, what the audience is only now beginning to see, was Daniel 2 nights later sitting across from a private investigator in a nearly empty diner on the edge of town, the kind of place with sticky menus and a bell over the door that hadn't rung twice in the same hour all evening. He slid an envelope of cash across the table, careful to keep his hand low, out of view of the security camera mounted above the register. "I need you to find out what she knows," Daniel said, voice low. "And I need you to make sure that woman never finds out anything more than she already has." The investigator, a heavy-set man named Turk who asked few questions as long as the money cleared, turned the envelope over once in his hand, weighing it before pocketing it. "Which woman are we talking about?" Daniel hesitated for exactly 1 second too long, a hesitation Turk noticed and filed away. The way men in his profession always file away the things clients don't want them to notice. "Doesn't matter which woman," Daniel said finally. "Just do the job. Quietly." There was a detail buried in Daniel's history that even Yvette, who had known him for over a decade, had never thought twice about. 15 years ago, before he'd joined Marcus at the company, Daniel had worked administrative logistics at St. Agnes Memorial Hospital, a job he rarely mentioned and had scrubbed almost entirely from his public biography, listing only early career in operations management on the rare occasions his background came up. It was the same hospital, the same records department, where a young clerk named Amara Whitfield would later file patient charts with careful, perfect handwriting. Years after Daniel had already left for the construction business, their paths had never directly crossed. The timeline hadn't overlapped by more than a year or two, and even then, only in the sense that they'd once walked the same fluorescent-lit hallways, filed papers in the same cabinets, worked under the same hospital administrators who'd later be quietly compensated to look the other way. It seemed, on its surface, like nothing at all, a coincidence too small to mention. It would turn out to be the opposite of nothing. Daniel's most effective weapon, though, wasn't secrecy. It was grief. Whenever Yvette pushed too hard on a question about the hospital, about the missing records, about the strange gaps in what she'd been told 8 years ago, Daniel had a single line he returned to, gently, like a man trying to help. "Marcus would be ashamed of you chasing ghosts like this," he told her one evening, his voice soft with practiced sorrow. "Let our brother rest, Yvette. Let yourself rest." Every time he said it, Yvette felt the question die a little in her throat. Grief, she was learning, could be turned into a leash if the right person knew how to hold it. The first real blow landed on a Thursday morning when Amara's landlord, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Osei, who had never once been late collecting rent but had also never been unkind, knocked on her door with a folded notice instead of his usual nod. "Rent's doubling," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Starting next month." Amara stared at the paper as if reading it twice might change the number. "Doubling? Mr. Osei, I've never missed a payment. Not once in 2 years. I've never even been late." "I know," he said. And for a moment something like guilt flickered across his face, quickly smoothed over. "New owners bought the building last month. Bought the whole block, actually. They set the numbers now, not me. I fought it for what it's worth. Told them you were one of the good tenants. Didn't matter to them." He shifted his weight, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. "I'm sorry, Amara. I really am." "Oh." She would later learn, though not for many weeks, not until Renata's investigation surfaced the paper trail, that the shell company which had quietly purchased 6 buildings across 3 low-income blocks that spring was one of dozens of holding entities under the umbrella of Callaway Construction's real estate arm, a side venture Daniel had built up over the years without ever putting his own name directly on the paperwork, always one or two shell layers removed, always deniable. It was, to Daniel, a minor real estate play, the kind of quiet asset accumulation that barely registered on his weekly calendar. To Amara, standing in her doorway holding a folded notice with hands that had suddenly gone cold, it was the difference between a roof and no roof. She didn't have the money. She barely had the money for the rent she was already paying, and she said so quietly, to a landlord who had no power left to help her, even if he wanted to. That night, after the children were asleep, Amara sat on the edge of her bed doing math on the back of a grocery receipt by the light of her phone, trying to make numbers stretch in ways numbers simply refused to stretch, adding and subtracting the same figures over and over as though sheer repetition might conjure a solution. She came up short every single time. She thought about calling her mother, 3 states away, and decided against it not out of pride exactly, but because she couldn't bear to hear the words "I told you so" wrapped inside even the kindest, most loving voice in the world. The next blow came 3 days later, under the bridge, in front of a line of waiting customers. A woman named Carla, who'd been coming to Amara for months and had always paid on time, sat in the folding chair getting a full head of box braids, nearly 3 hours of careful, exacting work, and when Amara finished, checking every part line with the same meticulous care she brought to everything, Carla stood up, checked her reflection in the cracked mirror nailed to the support beam, turned her head one way and then the other, and said flatly, "Actually, I don't think I like it. I'm not paying for this." Amara felt her stomach drop somewhere near her feet. "Carla, I did exactly what you asked for. You showed me the picture yourself. I matched it stitch for stitch." "It doesn't look like the picture," Carla snapped, her voice climbing, loud enough that heads turned along the row of parked cars above the underpass. "I'm not paying full price for a bad job from a girl who does hair under a bridge. What did you expect, a salon finish?" The words landed like a slap, each syllable deliberately chosen to cut. Zuri, sitting nearby with her homework spread across her knees, looked up sharply, her small face tightening with an anger no 7-year-old should have to carry on her mother's behalf, her pencil going still in her hand. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered by then, some out of idle curiosity, some already pulling out their phones, sensing the particular kind of spectacle that travels fast online. Amara felt heat rise up her neck, humiliation and rage tangled together so tightly she couldn't tell which one might make her cry first, could feel her own hands trembling as she reached for the folding table to steady herself. "Please," she said quietly, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, aware of every eye on her. "Just pay what we agreed on. I gave you 3 hours." "I'm not paying anything," Carla said, tossing her newly braided hair over one shoulder with a theatrical flip, and walked off without looking back, her new braids swinging behind her like a stolen prize she'd earned through cruelty instead of money. Nobody in the small crowd said a word in Amara's defense. A few people shook their heads sympathetically and drifted away, the way people do when sympathy costs nothing and involvement might cost something. Amara stood there a moment longer than she needed to, willing herself not to cry in front of her daughter, in front of strangers, in front of a world that seemed determined to remind her, again and again, exactly where it thought she belonged. It was in that exact moment, with Amara standing frozen in humiliation, and her daughter's eyes brimming with tears she was too proud to let fall, that a silver Mercedes slowed at the curb above the underpass. Yvette Callaway had not planned to stop. She'd been driving back from a site inspection, mind still tangled in Daniel's latest push to sell the company, the radio murmuring something she wasn't really listening to, when something about the scene below the bridge, a woman standing very still while a crowd watched her be humiliated. A little girl's face crumpling with fury she was too young to properly express, made her chest tighten in a way she couldn't explain. She told herself later it was simple decency, the kind any reasonably kind person would feel witnessing someone treated so unfairly. In the moment though, it felt like something closer to recognition, an inexplicable pull low in her stomach, though she recognized nothing about the woman at all, had never seen her face before in her life. She parked badly, half on the curb, and walked down the incline in heels that were entirely wrong for the terrain, catching once on loose gravel and not caring. And she reached the small folding table just as the last of the onlookers were drifting away, murmuring about the show they'd just watched, already forgetting it the way people forget things that don't happen to them. "How much did she owe you?" Yvette asked. Amara turned, startled, wiping quickly at her eyes before answering with whatever dignity she had left. "It's fine, you don't need to." "How much?" Something in the woman's voice, calm, immovable, entirely unlike anyone who usually stopped under that bridge, made Amara answer honestly. $60. Yvette handed her 100 without hesitation, then crouched slightly, her eyes drifting, unbidden, to the little girl sitting a few feet away with a wary protective expression far too old for her face. "What's your daughter's name?" Yvette asked, before she could stop herself. "Zuri," Amara said. Yvette's hands began to shake, she closed them into fists to hide it, but not quickly enough. "That's a beautiful name," she managed, her voice thinner than she intended. She stood, thanked Amara for nothing in particular, and walked back to her car in a daze she couldn't name. That night, for the first time in months, Yvette pulled the manila folder from her locked drawer and stared at the redacted name until her eyes burned. She didn't know why a stranger's daughter's name had knocked the air out of her. She only knew that it had, and that she needed to understand why before she could sleep again. She thought too about the woman herself, the tired dignity in her posture even while being humiliated, the way she'd tried to shield her daughter from the worst of it, the careful, practiced way her hands had moved through hair even in the middle of a crisis. There was something about Amara that reminded Yvette, faintly and without explanation, of the version of herself she'd been before grief had hollowed parts of her out, a woman who worked hard, loved fiercely, and refused to let circumstance define what she believed she deserved. Yvette drove home that night, replaying the scene over and over, unable to shake the sense that she'd witnessed something far more significant than an ordinary act of charity, though she had no language yet for what that significance might be. She did not sleep well. She rarely did anymore, but that night was different, restless in a way that felt less like grief and more like anticipation, the particular insomnia of standing at the edge of something about to change. Yvette did not go back under the bridge the next day, or the day after that. She told herself it would be strange, even inappropriate, for a woman in her position to insert herself into a stranger's life over nothing more than a coincidence and a name. But she found herself, 3 weeks later, quietly instructing Priya to set up an anonymous community grant through the company's small philanthropic fund, one that happened to cover exactly the difference between Amara's old rent and her new doubled one. "Should I list a program name for this?" Priya asked, scrolling through the paperwork. "Call it the Neighborhood Stability Grant," Yvette said. "Keep the recipient's files separate from the general fund records. And Priya, I don't want my name on any of it." Amara received the letter 2 days later, with the kind of disbelief that made her read it 4 times before she let herself hope it was real. A grant, fully covering her new rent, administered anonymously through a community fund she'd never heard of, requiring nothing from her but a signature. She cried on Zuri's shoulder that night, the kind of crying that comes from relief so sudden it feels dangerous, like it might be a trick that would be taken back the moment she believed in it. She never learned who was behind it. Not yet. Daniel learned about it within the week, not because he suspected anything about Amara specifically, but because he kept close, careful watch on Yvette's spending, and an unusual 6-figure line item routed through a new neighborhood stability grant caught his attention immediately. He dug deeper. He found, buried in Priya's careful but not careful enough paperwork, a note referencing a hospital adoption inquiry Yvette had made 8 years prior, cross-referenced against records from Street Agnes Memorial. His hands went cold reading it. He confronted Yvette that same evening, doing his best to sound casual. "You're looking into old hospital records again? I thought we agreed you'd let that go." "I don't recall agreeing to anything," Yvette said, not looking up from her desk, her pen still moving across a stack of paperwork she wasn't really reading anymore. "I recall you telling me to. There's a difference, Daniel, and I'd think a man in your position would understand it." "Yvette." Daniel's voice sharpened just slightly, just enough for the shift to register even through his usual practiced smoothness. He crossed the room and stood at the edge of her desk, hands braced against it, leaning in with an intensity that felt, for the first time in years, faintly threatening rather than protective. Whatever you think you're going to find, it isn't going to bring you peace. It's going to bring you pain, and I've spent 8 years trying to spare you exactly that. Please, trust me on this, if nothing else. Why would I trust the one person who keeps telling me not to look? Yvette asked, finally setting down her pen and meeting his eyes fully, something new and unfamiliar in her own expression, not quite suspicion yet, but the early architecture of it. Daniel had no answer ready for that. A rare and telling silence from a man who always had an answer ready. He straightened, adjusted his cufflinks in a gesture Yvette had seen him make 100 times before, as a way of resetting himself, and left her office without another word. For the first time in 8 years, Yvette watched her brother-in-law's composure crack just for a second, just enough for her to notice, a flicker of something raw beneath the practiced warmth, and she filed that crack away carefully. The way you file away a splinter you fully intend to dig out later, once you've found the right tool for it. The real damage that week, though, landed on Amara from an entirely different direction. Reggie came back. He appeared under the bridge on a Tuesday afternoon, thinner than she remembered, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that used to fill them out, his eyes carrying the particular hollowness of a man who had spent 2 years running from people scarier than his own conscience. Amara's stomach dropped the moment she saw him weaving through the underpass toward her table, and she instinctively pulled Zuri closer, one hand finding her daughter's shoulder without even thinking about it. "I need money," Reggie said. No greeting, no apology. Nothing resembling the man she'd married in a small church with folding chairs, back when his eyes still held something warm instead of this frantic animal wariness. "Just enough to get out of the city for a while, a few hundred, that's all I'm asking." "I don't have a few $100s, Reggie." She kept her voice low, aware of customers nearby pretending not to listen. "Look at where we live. Look at where you left us. You've got customers. You've got that grant thing I heard about. Don't play dumb with me." His eyes narrowed, calculating in a way that frightened her more than his desperation did. This wasn't the panicked husband who'd once been sweet and overwhelmed. This was someone new, someone worn down to something harder. "I need it, Amara, and if you don't help me, I swear to God I'll take the kids somewhere you'll never find them. I've got nothing left to lose. You understand me? Nothing." You wouldn't. But even as she said it, some old, tired part of her wasn't sure anymore. "Watch me." He stepped closer. Close enough that Zuri whimpered and buried her face in Amara's side, small fingers gripping fistfuls of her mother's shirt. Reggie's eyes flicked down to the little girl, and something bitter and strange twisted across his face, something Amara had seen only once before, years ago. In the middle of a fight so ugly she'd spent years trying not to remember it, back when Zuri was still an infant, and Reggie had come home drunk and furious over something that no longer mattered. "You always said Zuri wasn't even—" He stopped himself, cut the sentence off mid-breath, like a man realizing, 1/2 second too late, that he'd nearly stepped off a ledge with no way back up. "Wasn't even what?" Amara demanded, her voice shaking now, fear curdling into something colder and sharper. "Finish the sentence, Reggie. Say it." Reggie's jaw worked silently for a moment, his eyes darting away from hers, toward the traffic overhead, toward anywhere that wasn't her face. Then he shook his head, muttered something about needing to think, about this not being the time, and disappeared back into the crowd of the underpass at a half jog, leaving Amara standing there with her daughter clutched against her hip, and a sentence that would not stop echoing in her skull for weeks afterward. "You always said Zuri wasn't even." Wasn't even what? Hers? His? Real? The question followed her home that night, followed her into sleep, followed her into every quiet moment for days. A splinter lodged somewhere she couldn't quite reach to pull it out. That night, long after the children were asleep, Amara sat awake replaying every detail of Zuri's birth she could remember, a birth that had, now that she thought about it hard enough, always felt slightly wrong in ways she'd never let herself examine. The paperwork her mother-in-law had handled instead of her. The hospital she'd never actually visited to give birth in, despite what her own memory insisted. The birthmark her mother-in-law had told her, with strange urgency, to always keep covered. For the first time in 7 years, Amara allowed herself to wonder if Zuri was truly her biological daughter at all. She thought about the birth itself, a memory she realized, with a creeping unease, she had never actually examined closely. Her mother-in-law had been the one to handle the arrangements, as she'd always called them, insisting it would be easier on Amara, who'd had a difficult first trimester, to let her handle the paperwork and the details. Amara remembered exhaustion. She remembered holding a baby for the first time and feeling a flood of love so total it erased every other thought in her head. She did not remember, she realized now, actually being told which hospital they were at, or seeing her own name on any of the paperwork. She had trusted her mother-in-law completely, the way you trust a woman who has never once given you a reason not to until now, 7 years later, staring at a closed door with no one left alive to open it. Yvette hired a second investigator that week, not Turk, whom she'd never known existed, but a quiet, methodical woman named Renata Osgood, who had once helped a friend of Yvette's untangle a messy inheritance dispute, and had a reputation for discretion that mattered more to Yvette than speed. Renata worked out of a small office above a dry cleaner, kept no assistant, and had a habit of taking notes by hand in a leather notebook she never let out of arm's reach. "I need you to look into adoption and delivery records at Street Agnes Memorial, 8 years back," Yvette told her, sliding the manila folder across the table with hands that were, for once, almost steady. "Specifically anything involving a stillbirth report from that period. I have reason to believe there were irregularities. I need you to be thorough, and I need you to be quiet." "I'm always both," Renata said simply, and opened the folder. She took 2 weeks. When she came back, seated across from Yvette in the same locked office where the brass key lived, her expression was carefully neutral in the way professionals train themselves to be when they're about to deliver something difficult to someone they've grown, against their own professional instincts, to genuinely like. "The hospital's adoption records from that year have gaps," Renata said, laying out photocopies across the desk. "Several files are either missing entirely or were improperly archived, which, on its own, isn't unheard of. Hospitals lose paperwork all the time, especially in departments that changed software systems back then, which St. Agnes did. But one of the missing files has a birth date that matches yours almost exactly. Same week. Same maternity ward. Same attending physician, actually. He retired 4 years ago and hasn't returned my calls." Yvette's hands went still on the table, flat against the wood as though she needed something solid to hold on to. "Almost exactly." 3 days off, Renata said, watching her carefully. "It could be nothing, Yvette. Hospitals are chaotic places, but in 15 years of doing this work, I've rarely seen nothing produce this many locked doors, this many people who suddenly can't remember details they should remember, this many gaps that all seem to cluster around the exact same week." Around the same time, 14 miles away, Amara was going through a box of her late mother-in-law's belongings, something she'd been putting off for 2 years, unable to face the grief of sorting through the last physical traces of the woman who'd helped raise Zuri in her earliest, hardest months, back before everything had fallen apart. The box had sat unopened in a closet through 3 moves, and Amara had finally decided, on a quiet Sunday when the children were with a neighbor, that it was time. Near the bottom of the box, wrapped carefully in a faded floral scarf, tucked beneath a stack of old birthday cards and a well-worn rosary, she found a hospital identification bracelet. The thin plastic yellowed with age, but the printed lettering still perfectly legible. The name printed on it was not Zuri's. Amara sat on the floor of her small apartment for a long time, turning the bracelet over and over in her hands, reading the unfamiliar name again and again, as if repetition might force it to explain itself. Baby girl Calloway, a last name she had never once heard her mother-in-law mention in 7 years of knowing her, a name that meant absolutely nothing to Amara, and yet the bracelet had been kept hidden, really, protected among her mother-in-law's most private and cherished belongings, as though it mattered enough to preserve but too dangerous, or too painful, to ever explain. She thought about calling someone, anyone, and realized with a heavy sinking feeling that there was no one left to call. Her mother-in-law was gone, 2 years now, taken quickly by a stroke that hadn't left time for last conversations, let alone explanations of old hospital bracelets. Reggie had vanished again after their confrontation under the bridge, swallowed back into whatever underworld he was running from. And the only person who had shown her any real kindness lately, actual, tangible kindness, the kind that paid rent and stopped bullies in their tracks, was a stranger in a Mercedes whose name Amara still didn't even know. She wrapped the bracelet back in its scarf and placed it carefully in her nightstand drawer, unable to throw it away, and equally unable to look at it for more than a few seconds at a time. That night, she sat on the edge of Zuri's bed, long after her daughter had fallen asleep, watching the slow, even rise and fall of her small chest, tracing with her eyes the shape of a face she had memorized every single day for 7 years, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same habit of scrunching her nose when she concentrated, all the small details Amara had always simply assumed were passed down from somewhere, without ever once stopping to ask from where. She thought about the beaded bracelet Zuri wore every day, the one covering the small crescent birthmark her mother-in-law had always insisted stay hidden. She thought about the strange urgency in the older woman's voice whenever the subject came up, an urgency Amara had never questioned because questioning it had never once felt necessary, not when love filled every other corner of their life together. Now, for the first time, she wondered what her mother-in-law had known, and why she had chosen for 7 quiet years never to say a word. The next blow, when it came, was engineered. Daniel, growing increasingly uneasy about Yvette's quiet investigation, had begun looking for ways to destabilize anything connected to it, and in cross-referencing the neighborhood stability grant Yvette had authorized, he'd finally identified its recipient, a woman named Amara Whitfield, braiding hair under the Delmont Avenue overpass. He didn't yet understand why Yvette cared about her. He simply understood that removing the woman from Yvette's orbit would remove a variable he couldn't control. He made one phone call to a city code enforcement contact he'd cultivated over the years through the construction business, a favor he'd banked for exactly this kind of moment. Within days, Amara received an official notice, taped to the concrete pillar she'd worked beside for 2 years. Illegal vending on public infrastructure, subject to immediate cease and desist, violators to be fined and, if necessary, removed by city order. "I've been here 2 years," Amara told the enforcement officer, who delivered a second copy in person, her voice cracking with disbelief as she held her folding table like it might anchor her to the ground. "No one's ever said a word, not once. I don't understand." "Someone filed a formal complaint," the officer said, not unkindly, glancing at Zuri and Kofi with something like sympathy he wasn't allowed to act on. "Anonymous. But it's a legitimate complaint, and once it's filed, we're required to enforce it. I'm sorry. You'll need to relocate by the end of the week, or we'll have to confiscate the equipment." Amara stood under the bridge that had been her only stable ground for 2 years, the same bridge where she'd built a business out of nothing, where regulars like Miss Delphine had trusted her with their heads for hours at a time, where Zuri had learned her multiplication tables, and Kofi had taken his first steps on the cracked pavement and felt the floor drop out from under her all over again, the particular vertigo of watching something you built with your bare hands be dismantled by a decision you had no part in, and no power to appeal. When Yvette learned, almost by accident, a passing mention from Priya about an odd code enforcement complaint, tracked back to a shell address connected to the company that Daniel had orchestrated the eviction of a woman receiving Yvette's own anonymous grant, something shifted in her chest. It wasn't proof of anything specific, but it was the first time she let herself fully consider that Daniel wasn't simply overprotective, or grieving, or trying to spare her pain. He was hiding something big enough to sabotage a stranger over. Renata's investigation turned up one more thread that week, a maternity nurse named Colleen Ferris, who had worked the ward the night Yvette delivered, and who had since moved 2 states away and stopped answering calls the moment Renata mentioned the date in question. "She hung up on me twice," Renata told Yvette. "People don't hang up twice over nothing." It took Renata another 10 days, a subpoena threat that never had to be filed, and one long, tearful phone call before Colleen Ferris, now living 2 states away, working nights at a small community clinic, having built an entirely new life she clearly hoped would stay separate from her old one, finally agreed to talk. Off the record at first, her voice thin and guarded, then eventually, on it. "Your baby wasn't stillborn," Colleen said, her voice trembling through the phone as Yvette sat frozen at her desk, Renata beside her, recording with permission on the table between them, the office silent except for the low hum of the building's ventilation system. "I need you to understand I've carried this for 8 years. Every June when I know it's your baby's birthday, I think about it. I didn't have a choice at the time. Or I told myself I didn't, which I've come to understand isn't the same thing at all." "What happened to my daughter?" Yvette's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her free hand had gripped the edge of the desk hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "There was a complication during delivery, that part was real, that part I didn't lie about. But the baby survived, she was healthy, small but healthy, crying within the first minute. I held her myself before anyone else did." Colleen's voice cracked. Someone with authority in that unit, someone with money and connections to the hospital board, arranged for the birth to be recorded as a stillbirth instead. The real paperwork was falsified within hours. The baby was released, off the books, into a private adoption before you ever woke up from the medication they'd given you. Yvette's chest felt like it had been hollowed out with a blunt instrument, all the air pressed slowly out of her lungs. "Who arranged it? I need a name, Colleen, please." Colleen hesitated so long Renata thought for a moment that the call had dropped. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was paid to sign off on the falsified stillbirth report and to keep quiet about it permanently. The man who paid me worked in hospital administration at the time, in a position that let him move through records like he owned the place. His name was Daniel Calloway." The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute. Renata reached over and gently paused the recording, giving Yvette a moment before continuing, watching her employer's face shift through something that looked almost like physical pain. Yvette did not scream, she did not cry, not yet. She sat very still, the way people sit when the ground beneath them has fundamentally changed shape and their body hasn't caught up to the new terrain. She thought of every dinner Daniel had bought her in the years since. Every gentle hand on her shoulder at company events when someone mentioned children. Every time he'd said, so kindly, so convincingly, that Marcus would be proud of how she'd handled her grief. Every single one of those moments now curdled in her memory into something else entirely, not comfort, but control. Daniel had not simply mishandled paperwork out of misplaced loyalty. He had orchestrated the entire disappearance of her daughter, while she lay unconscious after nearly dying to bring that child into the world. He had let her grieve a lie for 8 years, had discouraged every question she'd ever asked with practiced, patient concern, had comforted her with her dead husband's imagined disapproval as a leash to keep her from ever finding the truth. He had sat across from her at family dinners, at board meetings, at Marcus's own funeral, knowing exactly where her daughter was and choosing, deliberately, every single day, to say nothing. She still did not know where her daughter was. She still did not know the child was, at that very moment, 7 years old, and doing multiplication tables on an overturned bucket under a bridge 14 miles away. The audience knows. Yvette does not yet. That gap, that terrible unclosed distance between what the audience understands and what Yvette has not yet allowed herself to piece together, would become the engine driving everything that came next. Daniel, for his part, sensed the walls tightening days before Yvette ever confronted him. Renata's inquiries, careful as they were, had rippled back to Colleen Ferris's old hospital contacts, and word traveled as it always does, faster than anyone intends. Daniel tracked Colleen down himself, offering through an intermediary, never his own name, a compensation package, in exchange for her continued silence. Colleen refused. 8 years of guilt had finally outweighed 8 years of fear. "I'm done being quiet," she told the intermediary. "You can tell him that." The most dangerous night of Amara's life began with a knock she assumed was Zuri's teacher, dropping off missed homework after a parent-teacher conference ran late. It was Reggie. He didn't ask for money this time. There was a wildness in his eyes that Amara registered half a second too late to react to, and before she could fully process what was happening, he'd pushed past her into the small apartment and grabbed Kofi off the couch, the 4-year-old shrieking in confusion and terror, small fists flailing against a father he barely remembered. By the time Amara reached the doorway, her own scream still forming in her throat, Reggie was already halfway down the stairwell, with her son clutched against his chest. "Reggie! Reggie, stop! Please!" She ran into the street barefoot, the pavement tearing at her feet, screaming his name until her voice tore raw, but his car was already pulling away from the curb, tires screeching, taillights swallowed by traffic within seconds. Amara stood in the middle of the street, chest heaving, watching the space where the car had been as though staring hard enough might reverse time. Then she collapsed onto the curb, Zuri sobbing beside her, small arms wrapped tight around her mother's neck, and called the police with hands shaking too badly to properly dial, missing the numbers twice before the call finally connected. The next 4 hours were the longest of Amara's life. Officers took a report, moving with the unhurried procedural calm that felt, to Amara, like watching someone stroll while her son's life hung in the balance. A neighbor, hearing the commotion, posted about it on the local community board, adding a photo of Reggie's car pulled from an old social media post. Somehow, and Amara would spend weeks afterward trying to understand exactly how the pieces had connected so quickly. Word reached Yvette Calloway's office by early evening, carried through Priya, who had, in one of those small coincidences that later feel like fate rearranging itself, seen the community board post scrolling through her phone during a coffee break and recognized Amara's name instantly from the grant paperwork she'd processed months earlier. Priya didn't hesitate either. She walked straight into Yvette's office without knocking, phone already extended. "You need to see this." Yvette read the post twice, her blood running cold at the words 4-year-old boy, taken by non-custodial father, believed armed, considered dangerous. She did not hesitate after that. She authorized private security within minutes, personally called a contact she knew on the police department's missing persons unit, a contact built over years of charity work she'd never once expected to need for something like this, and funded an emergency search effort that mobilized within hours, resources that would have taken a family like Amara's days, if not weeks, to access on their own, through the ordinary, underfunded channels available to them. Security teams fanned out to check motels along the interstate. A helicopter, arranged through a favor Yvette called in without a second thought, swept the highway corridor leading out of the city. She told herself, again and again through those 4 unbearable hours, that it was simple decency, the natural response of anyone with the means to help a family in crisis. She did not examine too closely why her hands wouldn't stop shaking the entire time, why she found herself pacing her office barefoot, heels discarded, praying silently and obsessively, actually praying. For the first time in years for a child she had never met and, as far as she consciously knew, had no connection to at all. At the police station, Amara sat in a hard plastic chair beneath humming fluorescent lights that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the hospital she'd once worked in. Zuri curled against her side, exhausted but too frightened to sleep. An officer brought her a cup of vending machine coffee she didn't drink, its warmth the only comfort she let herself accept. Every time a phone rang somewhere in the precinct, her whole body went rigid, bracing for news she wasn't sure she had the strength to hear either way. She thought, in those hours, about every mistake she'd ever made marrying Reggie despite her mother's warning, trusting him even after the strangers started circling, not leaving sooner, not seeing sooner, and hated herself a little more with each passing minute. The particular self-blame that grips parents in crisis regardless of how unearned it actually is. It was near 11 that night when Yvette herself arrived at the precinct, having insisted on being kept updated directly, rather than through second-hand reports, and sat down in the chair beside Amara without asking permission, without offering explanation for why a stranger in a tailored coat had any business being there at all. She simply sat, present and steady, and after a moment, without either woman fully deciding to do it, Amara let her head rest briefly against Yvette's shoulder. Too tired and too frightened to question why it felt, inexplicably, like the safest place in the room. Kofi was found just after midnight, unharmed but terrified, in a motel 40 minutes outside the city, after a tip from a suspicious desk clerk led police straight to Reggie's room. He'd apparently intended to use the boy as leverage for a ransom he never got the chance to demand, cornered by police before he could even make the call. Kofi found sitting on the edge of a stained motel bed clutching a pillow, tear-streaked but physically unharmed. When officers apprehended him, Reggie, cornered and desperate, understanding with sudden clarity that his freedom was already gone, screamed the one thing he'd been holding back for weeks, loud enough for the gathering crowd of officers, paramedics, and witnesses in the motel parking lot to hear clearly, his voice cracking with something that sounded almost like a twisted attempt at revenge against a world he felt had already ruined him. "Zuri isn't even mine! She's not even Amara's, not really! Ask her about the hospital. Ask her mother-in-law. Ask anybody. Go on. Ask somebody." Amara, standing nearby wrapped in a scratchy emergency blanket a paramedic had draped over her shoulders, Kofi already sprinting into her arms and burying his face against her neck, felt the words hit her like a physical blow, harder somehow than anything Reggie had said in months of threats. The crowd around her went quiet, the kind of sudden hush that happens when strangers realize they've just witnessed something they shouldn't have. Somewhere behind her, through the ringing in her own ears, she was vaguely aware of a woman's voice, Yvette's. Though Amara barely registered whose voice it was in the chaos of relief and horror tangled together, asking softly, urgently, almost desperately. "What did he just say? Say that again. What did he just say?" Later that night, once Kofi was safely settled into the back seat with a juice box a paramedic had produced from somewhere, wrapped in his mother's arms, and the adrenaline had finally drained out of Amara enough to let grief and confusion flood in behind it, she found herself sitting across from Yvette in the back of a private car, the two women alone for the first time, with nothing between them but exhaustion, streetlight through the window, and half-truths neither of them had ever said out loud. "I need to tell someone," Amara said quietly, staring at her hands, still faintly trembling from the night's terror. "I don't even know why I'm telling you. You're basically a stranger. I don't even know your last name, if I'm honest. But you've done more for my family in 3 months than anyone has in 3 years. And I don't have anyone else left to say this to. My mother's 3 states away. My mother-in-law's gone. There's just no one." Yvette said nothing, only waited, her own hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Some instinct telling her that whatever came next mattered more than almost anything she'd heard in 8 years. "Zuri isn't my biological daughter," Amara said, the words finally breaking loose after 7 years of never speaking them aloud. "My mother-in-law arranged a private adoption when Zuri was an infant. I never asked too many questions. I was grateful. I was desperate for a healthy baby, and my mother-in-law told me the paperwork was handled, that it was legitimate, and I believed her because I needed to. She's gone now. I never learned where Zuri really came from. I found a hospital bracelet a few weeks ago with a name that isn't Zuri's, a last name I didn't recognize. Calloway." Yvette went pale in the dim light of the car, a stillness overtaking her entire body. "What did the bracelet say?" she asked, very quietly. "Exactly." "Baby girl Calloway," Amara said. Yvette's hands began to shake, worse than they had outside the courthouse in the story's opening moment, worse than they had the day she first heard Zuri's name under the bridge. "Can I see her wrist?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Zuri's wrist. There's a mark. A birthmark. Can I see it?" Amara, too exhausted and too raw to question the strangeness of the request, nodded slowly, understanding on some primal level, even before her conscious mind caught up, that they had just stepped over the edge of something enormous. The next morning, in the quiet of Amara's small apartment, Zuri sat patiently while Yvette gently unclasped the beaded bracelet she'd worn every day of her life. Underneath it, on the inside of her left wrist, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. It matched exactly the description in the medical file Yvette had kept locked in her drawer for 8 years. Neither woman said anything for a long moment. Yvette pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears finally spilling over after 8 years of grief she'd never fully let herself release. and Amara watching a stranger fall apart in front of her, still not fully understanding why, felt something cold and enormous settle into her own chest, a dread she couldn't yet name but somehow already recognized as true. Yvette did not say a single word about what the birthmark might mean, not that day, not the next, not even when she lay awake that night, replaying the shape of it over and over behind closed eyes. Every instinct in her screamed to demand answers immediately, to grab this child and never let go, to march into a lab and force an answer out of the world by sheer will. But a different instinct, quieter, harder one, forged from 8 years of grief that had already been weaponized against her once by a man she trusted, held her back, insisting on caution even as her whole body ached for certainty. "I need proof," she told Renata that afternoon, sitting in the small office above the dry cleaner, her voice steady even though her hands hadn't stopped trembling since the day before. "Not a birthmark. Not a hunch. Not a feeling, no matter how strong. I refuse to destroy an innocent family based on nothing more than a coincidence that happens to match my own grief a little too neatly. If I'm wrong, if this is nothing more than my own desperation dressing itself up as evidence, I could shatter a little girl's entire sense of who her mother is, for nothing. I won't do that, not even for this." Renata nodded, understanding immediately. "A DNA test then. Quiet. Discreet." Yvette arranged it within days, framing the request to Amara not as anything related to the bracelet or the birthmark, but as a company scholarship health screening, a benefit, she explained through Priya's careful paperwork, occasionally extended to grant recipients' children. Standard and painless, nothing to worry about. It was a small lie built entirely out of protectiveness, a way to spare Amara's dignity and Zuri's innocence until there was something real, something certain, to tell them both. Amara received the request framed exactly as Yvette had planned it, a company scholarship health screening, standard paperwork, nothing to raise alarm. She signed the consent form at her kitchen table with Zuri doing homework across from her, completely unaware that the swab a nurse gently collected from her daughter's cheek 2 days later carried the power to rearrange every certainty in her family's life. She thought, if she thought about it at all, that it was a small kindness among the many small kindnesses Yvette had already shown them, never once suspecting it was the final piece of a puzzle that had been assembling itself around her for months without her knowledge. Daniel discovered the test was happening 3 days before the results were due, a slip from a lab technician who mentioned it during an unrelated call about company health benefits, not realizing the significance of what he was casually revealing. Daniel's blood ran cold the moment the words paternity marker left the man's mouth. He spent 2 frantic days trying to identify which lab, which technician, which sample, working every contact and favor he had left, calling in debts he'd been saving for exactly this kind of emergency, trying to intercept the results before Yvette ever laid eyes on them. He very nearly succeeded. The lab technician assigned to process the sample, a careful young man named Oliver, who had handled thousands of routine tests without incident in his 6 years at the facility, noticed something unusual on the case file. A request, routed through an unfamiliar secondary contact with credentials that didn't quite match the standard authorization format, asking that the results for this specific case be forwarded to an alternate email address before the standard delivery went out. It wasn't illegal exactly on its surface. It also wasn't right, and something about the phrasing of the request, a little too eager, a little too specific, made the hair on Oliver's arm stand up. His instincts, the same quiet, unglamorous decency that keeps most institutions from quietly collapsing when no one's watching, told him something was wrong long before he could have explained why. Instead of following the unusual request, he picked up the phone and called Yvette directly, using the contact number on file rather than the one attached to the suspicious request. "I wanted to confirm you actually authorized a secondary recipient for these results," he said, his voice careful, professional, a little apologetic for even asking. "It felt off to me. I wanted to check before I sent anything anywhere I wasn't sure it should go." Yvette had authorized no such thing. Her voice when she answered came out sharper than she intended. "Send it to me, only me. Thank you for calling." She sat with the phone still in her hand for a long moment afterward, understanding with total clarity that someone and she already had a fairly good idea, who had just tried, and failed, to steal the truth out from under her a second time. That single act of ordinary integrity, a lab tech choosing to make one careful phone call instead of quietly complying, closed the last door Daniel had left open. Meanwhile, Colleen Ferris, finally free of 8 years of silence that had clearly cost her more than she'd ever admitted to herself, agreed to give a full recorded statement to Renata, on the record this time, with her own lawyer present across the table to make sure nothing she said could be twisted or denied later. She confirmed everything, methodically, painfully, item by item: the falsified stillbirth report she'd signed under pressure, the cash payment from Daniel delivered in an envelope not unlike the one he'd later hand Turk, the off-book private adoption arranged through a contact of his at a family services office, the same contact, it would turn out, who had processed the paperwork Amara's grieving, well-meaning mother-in-law believed to be entirely legitimate. Never once suspecting the child she was bringing home to her son's young wife had a mother somewhere still believing that baby had died. Why did he do it? Renata asked gently, near the end of the recording, leaning forward slightly. Why go to such extreme lengths over a stillbirth report? People fake plenty of things when they're desperate or ashamed. This one is unusual, even by the standards of the work I do. Colleen was quiet for a long time before she answered, her lawyer's pen going still on his notepad. "Because the baby wasn't Marcus's," she said finally, the words coming out low and heavy, like something she'd been carrying uphill for years and was finally, gratefully, setting down. "Yvette's husband wasn't the father, Daniel was. I only found out because I overheard him on the phone in the hallway outside the delivery room, panicking. The night before he arranged everything, his voice pitched low but not low enough. He kept saying over and over that if the child ever grew up looking like him, if anyone ever thought to run a test, everything he'd built his place in that family, his share of the company, his own brother's trust and love would be gone in an instant, gone forever, gone in a way he could never talk his way back out of. He didn't do what he did to protect Yvette from grief, whatever he's told himself in the years since to sleep at night. He did it to protect himself. Every part of it, start to finish, was about protecting himself." The DNA results arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered directly and only to Yvette, exactly as Oliver had promised, in a plain sealed envelope that felt absurdly light for something carrying so much weight. She read them alone in her office, door locked, the blinds drawn against the late afternoon sun, the same brass key she'd worn around her neck for 8 years now feeling impossibly heavy against her chest, as though it had somehow absorbed the density of everything it had been protecting. Zuri Whitfield was, without any statistical margin left for doubt, her biological daughter. And according to the secondary paternal marker, Renata had quietly, carefully arranged to test against a sample Daniel had unknowingly left on a discarded coffee cup during a meeting weeks earlier, a small, almost absurdly ordinary piece of forensic opportunism that felt like poetic justice. Once Yvette learned about it, Zuri was also, without question, Daniel's biological daughter. Yvette sat with the results for a long time before she did anything at all, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, tears finally falling freely now that there was no one left in the room to see them. She thought of every June she'd stood alone in that hospital parking lot, grieving a child who had, this entire time, been growing up 14 miles away, learning to braid hair on an overturned bucket, doing multiplication tables under a bridge, laughing at jokes Yvette had never heard, having a whole entire life Yvette had missed every single day of. The grief of the last 8 years did not disappear with the confirmation. If anything, it sharpened into something new and almost unbearable grief, not for a death but for time itself, for years that could never be returned to her, no matter what happened next. She did not call the police first, though every legal instinct told her that might be the correct order of operations. She did not call Amara first either, though every maternal instinct screamed at her to drive straight to that apartment and hold her daughter, even if Zuri had no idea yet what that embrace would mean. Instead, she picked up her phone, dialed a number she knew by heart, and asked Daniel to meet her, alone, at the office, that evening, giving him, against every instinct for justice she possessed, One final chance to be honest with her before she brought the truth to anyone else. "I want to give you a chance," she told him when he arrived, her voice carefully, deliberately calm, though her hands stayed clasped tightly in her lap where he couldn't see them shake. "One chance to tell me the truth yourself, before I have to hear it from someone else, in front of everyone." Daniel studied her face for a long moment, searching it for clues about how much she already knew, his usual easy charm noticeably absent for the first time in the years Yvette had known him. Something in her stillness, a stillness that had nothing left in it to lose, must have told him it was already too late to lie his way out cleanly. "Whatever you think you've found," he said slowly, choosing each word like a man testing ice for cracks. "I need you to understand I did what I did to protect this family, to protect Marcus's legacy, to protect you, Yvette, from a scandal that would have destroyed everything he spent his whole life building." "You protected yourself," Yvette said quietly, her voice never once rising, which somehow made it worse. "You let me grieve a child who was alive and breathing 14 miles from my own house. You paid a nurse to lie to my face while I was still recovering from nearly dying to bring that baby into the world. You had her placed with a stranger, off the books, so illegally that if anyone had ever traced it back properly, an innocent family could have lost everything they'd built, a family that had nothing to do with any of this, that took in a baby in good faith and loved her exactly the way a family should. And you did all of it, Daniel, not for Marcus, not for me, but because you were afraid of what a simple DNA test might one day reveal about you." Daniel's composure finally cracked, the practiced warmth sliding off his face like a mask coming loose at the seams, revealing something colder and more frightened underneath. "She would have been a walking scandal, Yvette, don't you understand that? My affair with my brother's wife, splashed across every business page in the state, our family's name dragged through headlines for a decade. I did what I had to do. Anyone in my position would have done the same." "No," Yvette said simply. "They wouldn't have." She did not raise her voice after that. She did not cry. Not this time, not with him still in the room to see it. She simply reached into her coat pocket and set her phone face up on the desk between them, a recording app clearly running, the timestamp visible in the corner of the screen, unmistakable and undeniable. Daniel stared at it, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something like real fear crossed his face. "I need you to say all of that again," Yvette said, "for the board, on Monday." The emergency shareholders meeting was called for the following Monday morning, ostensibly to discuss a matter of company governance requiring the full board's immediate attention. The wording had been deliberately vague, Yvette's doing, on Renata's advice, to keep Daniel from suspecting exactly how much ground had already shifted beneath him. Daniel arrived in his usual pressed suit, coffee in hand, greeting the security guards by name as always, expecting a business dispute, perhaps another push from Yvette to finally block the company's sale he'd been chasing for months. He was not prepared for what came next, and nothing in his easy, confident stride down the hallway suggested he had any idea his entire life was about to change in the next 15 minutes. The boardroom was fuller than usual, 11 board members instead of the typical 8, Yvette having quietly ensured every relevant party would be present. Sunlight cut across the long glass table in sharp diagonal lines. Yvette stood at the head of it, Renata seated quietly to her left with a slim folder of documents. The lawyer for the board positioned at the far end taking notes. She did not raise her voice when she began. She didn't need to. The room had a way of going still around her when she spoke, a quality of authority she'd earned the hard way over 4 difficult years. 8 years ago I was told my daughter died during childbirth, she said, looking directly at Daniel as the room fell into confused, uncomfortable silence. That was a lie. My daughter is alive, she's 7 years old, and the man responsible for taking her from me, for letting me grieve a lie for 8 years, is sitting at this table right now. She played the recording. Daniel's own voice filled the room through the small speaker Renata had set at the center of the table, flat, damning, unmistakably his, every word landing with the particular horror of hearing someone convict themselves in their own unguarded tone. It played through the affair, the falsified stillbirth report, the payment to a terrified young nurse, the illegal off-book adoption arranged with surgical precision to erase any trace of a child who might one day grow up looking exactly like him. The board sat in stunned, frozen silence as it played, several members glancing instinctively toward Daniel as though checking whether the voice in the recording could possibly belong to the same man sitting 3 seats down from them. Pale now, jaw clenched, staring fixedly at the table's polished surface. Someone near the back audibly gasped when Daniel's recorded voice said, flat and cold, "She would have been a walking scandal." Another board member, an older woman who had known Daniel for over 15 years, pressed a hand to her mouth and did not lower it again for the rest of the meeting. Daniel, recovering just enough to try one last desperate maneuver, stood abruptly. "This is manipulated. This is a grieving, unstable woman who has spent months chasing ghosts and paranoid theories, and now she's trying to destroy my reputation with some doctored audio." "The recording isn't the only evidence," Yvette said calmly, nodding to Renata, who slid a second folder across the table to the board's legal counsel. "A sworn, notarized statement from the nurse Daniel paid to falsify the stillbirth report is already in your hands. So is the lab report confirming the biological paternity of my daughter. So is a documented timeline of the eviction notice Daniel orchestrated against her adoptive family, once he realized I was getting close to the truth." The room turned, almost as one, to look at Daniel, the man who had brought them pastries every Monday for a decade, who had known every security guard's name, whose reputation for warmth had just been unmade in the span of 11 minutes. Amara, brought quietly to the meeting at Yvette's request, sat near the back of the room, still absorbing everything she was hearing in real time. She'd been told only that morning gently and carefully by Yvette herself, sitting across from her at Amara's kitchen table with Zuri asleep in the next room. "The woman who has been helping you for months, without ever telling you why, is your daughter's biological mother." Amara had not screamed, had not raged, had not done any of the things she might have imagined doing if someone had described this scenario to her a year ago. She had simply cried, quietly, for a long time. Grief and gratitude and fear tangled together in a way that had no clean name. Both women, she understood now, sitting in that boardroom watching Daniel's carefully built life come apart in real time, had been manipulated by the exact same man, years apart, in different ways that had somehow led to the same child. When the meeting finally ended, when the board voted unanimously, without a single dissent to suspend Daniel's authority pending a full investigation, security quietly escorted him from the building, his protests growing fainter as the elevator doors closed behind him for what would be the last time he ever rode up to that 11th floor as anything other than a defendant. Yvette walked to the back of the room, her legs unsteady beneath her now that the adrenaline of the confrontation had finally begun to drain away, and sat down beside Amara without a word. Neither woman spoke for a long moment, the weight of everything that had just happened settling slowly into the space between them. Then Amara reached over, unsure of herself, unsure of what any of this made them to each other now, and took Yvette's hand. "Thank you," Yvette whispered, her voice breaking for the first time all morning, "for raising her so well, for loving her the way I never got the chance to." Amara's breath caught, tears finally spilling over after holding them back through the entire meeting. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for finding her. For not giving up even when I know it would have been easier." For a moment, neither of them cared who was watching. Two women, strangers 6 months earlier, sat holding hands in a boardroom that had just witnessed the collapse of the man who'd stolen years from both of them in different, terrible ways, and something quiet and unspoken passed between them. The beginning of whatever they were going to build together going forward. The board's vote to remove Daniel from the company was unanimous, and swift in a way corporate boards rarely manage to be, most of them still too shaken by what they'd just heard to consider anything but immediate action. Within 72 hours, his executive access was revoked. His office cleared under supervision by 2 security guards who, weeks earlier, would have greeted him with the same warmth he'd always shown them, and a formal referral made to the district attorney's office covering falsification of medical records, obstruction, and fraud connected to the illegal off-book adoption scheme. The story broke publicly within the week, not through any leak Yvette orchestrated, since she'd asked everyone involved to keep the matter strictly internal for as long as possible, but through a business journalist who'd been quietly investigating the sudden, unexplained shakeup at Callaway Construction, and pieced together enough from public board filings and a handful of nervous, off-the-record comments to ask the right pointed questions. Once the headline ran "Construction co-owner removed amid falsified hospital records scandal," the collapse accelerated on its own, gathering the particular momentum that only public disgrace seems to generate. Longtime business partners issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves within days, several using nearly identical phrasing about deeply troubling allegations that made it clear none of them wanted to be caught defending him publicly. A country club board he'd sat on for a decade quietly revoked his membership without so much as a phone call. A charity gala he'd chaired for 3 consecutive years, one that had always featured his face prominently on the invitations, replaced him without public comment, the kind of silent erasure that speaks louder than any headline ever could. The warmth people had once described so readily, the pastries every Monday, the remembered birthdays, the easy self-deprecating jokes about his golf swing, curdled overnight into something people described instead as calculated and manipulative, the same exact behaviors reread now through a different, truer lens. The way a familiar photograph looks entirely different once you learn what was happening just outside the frame. Daniel was formally charged 3 weeks later, the charges more extensive than even Yvette had expected once the district attorney's office finished its own independent investigation, adding financial fraud charges tied to the shell real estate purchases used to pressure tenants like Amara. His lawyers negotiated what protection they could, floating a plea deal that would have kept the worst details out of open court, but the recorded confession, corroborated by Colleen Ferris's sworn statement, the lab technician's documented account of the intercepted request, and the extensive paper trail Renata had painstakingly assembled, left little room to maneuver. He faced years of litigation ahead of him, the company he'd helped run for a decade permanently closed to him by court order, and a public reputation that would never fully recover, no matter how many carefully worded statements his expensive legal team issued on his behalf. Reggie's arrest, handled separately by the police through the ordinary channels of the justice system, closed the second threat of danger that had hung over Amara's family for years. Charged with attempted extortion, unlawful custodial interference, and several related counts stemming from the motel incident, he would not be walking free again for a long time, a resolution that gave Amara something even more valuable than abstract justice. The simple, hard-won, almost unfamiliar feeling of safety, the knowledge that her children could finally sleep without her lying awake beside them, listening for footsteps on the stairs, bracing for a knock that might come at any hour. Justice, in the end, did not arrive with dramatic flourish or courtroom theatrics. It arrived the way real justice usually does, through careful documentation, patient investigators willing to knock on doors twice, one honest lab technician who made a single phone call instead of looking away, one nurse who finally chose truth over 8 years of fear, and a board of directors willing to look clearly at evidence rather than protect a comfortable reputation. It was quieter than the karma story endings people sometimes imagine when they picture villains getting what they deserve. It was also, in its own way, far more satisfying, because every single consequence Daniel eventually faced, he had built entirely for himself, one careful lie at a time. Over 8 long years he'd spent believing he would never be caught. There was no custody battle. Yvette made sure of that from the very beginning, refusing even to let her own lawyers raise the possibility, though several of them gently suggested she at least explore her legal options given the circumstances. "I'm not here to take her from you," she told Amara, sitting once again at that same small kitchen table where this had all somehow started, weeks after the truth had finally settled into something the 2 women could speak about, without either of them crying through the entire conversation. "You raised her. You held her through fevers and nightmares and every hard year this city threw at you both. You're her mother in every single way that's ever actually mattered to that little girl, and nothing a lab result says is going to change that fact. Her voice wavered slightly, and she pressed on through it. "I'd like to be allowed into her life. Slowly. However you both need it to happen, on whatever timeline feels right to you. Even if, for a long while, That just means being someone who exists quietly at the edges of it. Amara studied her for a long moment, thinking of everything the last few months had taken from her, and given her back in equal, strange, overwhelming measure: the humiliation, and the grant, the eviction notice, and the rescued son, the stolen sentence from Reggie's mouth, and the answer that had finally arrived to complete it. "What should she call you?" she asked finally, her voice gentle. "Whatever feels true to her," Yvette said. Something like hope breaking gently across her face for the first time in 8 years. "I'd be honored if it started with Aunt Yvette. There's no rush past that, not from me. I've waited 8 years already, not even knowing what I was waiting for. I can wait as long as she needs, for as long as it takes her to decide, on her own terms, what I'm allowed to be to her." It was Zuri, in the end, who decided how quickly the world could expand around her. And she decided it the way children often do, with far less complication than the adults around her had braced themselves for. Within a few months, Aunt Yvette was simply part of the rhythm of her week, picking her up from school on Thursdays in a car far too fancy for the neighborhood, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Amara's apartment patiently working through multiplication tables, showing up to Kofi's preschool graduation with a bouquet of flowers nearly as big as he was, and crying openly through the entire 15-minute ceremony, to the visible amusement of the other parents. Zuri, for her part, seemed to absorb the new woman in her life the way children absorb most things that are offered with patience and consistency, not as a replacement for anything, but as an addition. One more person in the growing circle of adults who clearly, obviously adored her. The bridge changed too. And this, more than anything else, felt to Amara like the truest measure of everything that had happened. Using a portion of what would have gone toward Daniel's buyout of the company, a decision Yvette made unilaterally, and never once regretted, she funded the full renovation of the Delmont Avenue underpass into a proper community training center. Real chairs bolted to the floor, real mirrors instead of a cracked one nailed to a beam. A small classroom space with folding tables, proper heating for the winter months that had once cut straight through every layer Amara owned. Amara, given both the funding and the full trust to shape it however she saw fit, turned it into exactly what she'd once needed herself and never had. A place where other struggling mothers could learn a trade: braiding, and eventually cosmetology licensing classes taught by a volunteer instructor Yvette recruited from a local college with real wages, real contracts, and real dignity attached to the work, the kind of dignity that had once been stripped from Amara in front of a jeering crowd on that very same patch of pavement. She hired 3 women in the first 6 months, each of them with a story that echoed pieces of her own, and she trained them the way her own mother had once trained her, patiently, precisely, treating every strand of hair like it mattered. Because it did. On a quiet afternoon almost a year after that first humiliating scene under the old bridge, Yvette stood near the back of the new training center, watching Zuri sit cross-legged on the floor with a doll in her lap, carefully, patiently braiding its hair the exact way her mother had taught her, dead straight down the middle, tight at the root, the same technique an old customer named Miss Delphine had once said she'd only ever seen one other woman use in all her years of getting her hair done. Yvette watched her daughter's small hands move with a focus and gentleness that mirrored, almost exactly, the way Yvette herself had once braided her own doll's hair as a little girl. Decades before any of this had happened, before grief and lies and 8 lost years had ever entered the story, back when she was simply a child who loved hair the same unhurried, careful way her own daughter apparently loved it now, an inheritance passed down through blood that neither of them had known was there until a stranger's kindness under a bridge had made it visible. Miss Delphine, now a regular at the new center just as she'd been a regular under the bridge, sat nearby getting her twists redone by one of Amara's new hires, and she caught Yvette's eye across the room with a knowing, gentle smile, as if some small part of her had suspected the resemblance all along and simply never had the words for it. It was full circle in the quietest way possible, not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of ending built for applause or dramatic music swelling underneath it. Just 2 women who had both been failed, in different and terrible ways, by the same man they'd once trusted, one as a husband's brother, one as a family's protector, choosing, together, to build something honest out of what was left. A family stitched from truth instead of secrets, patient enough to grow slowly, strong enough to hold every version of the story that had brought them here, unwilling to erase any of the hard parts in favor of a tidier version. Amara watched from the doorway, arms crossed loosely, a small, tired, genuine smile on her face as she looked at her daughter braiding a doll's hair on the floor, at the woman who had once been nothing more than a stranger in a Mercedes on the worst afternoon of Amara's year, at Kofi napping safely in the corner on a proper cot instead of a folded blanket, at the life they were all, together, finally allowed to build out in the open, with nothing left hidden and nothing left to fear. Some bridges, it turns out, are not meant to be crossed alone. And some families are not the ones we're born into, but the ones we build, slowly, honestly, out of everything that's left standing after the truth finally comes out.
True wealth is never measured by money, status, or power, but by love, integrity, and the courage to do what is right. Amara's unwavering devotion to her children proves that a mother's love is defined by sacrifice, not by biology. Despite poverty, heartbreak, and countless hardships, she refused to give up, showing that dignity and determination can survive even the darkest circumstances. Yvette's journey reminds us that the truth may remain hidden for years, but it can never stay buried forever. Lies built on greed and selfishness eventually collapse under the weight of honesty. Daniel gained power by deception, yet in the end he lost everything because no success can be built on betrayal. The story also highlights the importance of compassion, as a single act of kindness can change someone's life forever. Yvette's decision to help a struggling stranger set in motion the discovery of a life changing truth. Most importantly, the story teaches that family is created through love, care, and sacrifice, not merely through blood. While biology revealed who gave Zuri life, it was Amara who gave her a childhood filled with unconditional love, protection, and hope. In the end, justice prevailed because brave people chose truth over fear, forgiveness over hatred, and love over selfishness. No matter how painful the past may be, honesty has the power to heal broken hearts, restore lost families, and prove that even after years of darkness, hope can still lead the way to a brighter future.